Drawing is a mix of theory and practice. You can watch tutorials, read guides, and hear advice, but until you apply it, it doesn't really translate into your own work. That's why in this video I would like to share what I do to draw illustrations while also explaining how you can adapt these ideas to your own process. Hi, here's May. In today's video I want to walk you through my full drawing process. Not just showing how I move from sketch to finished illustration, but also talking about the little things I do that make drawing more enjoyable and efficient. I'll also share some mistakes I've made and honestly still make sometimes, so you don't have to fall into the same traps. If you've seen my older video about how I approached drawing ensemble stars characters while explaining my drawing process, this video is like an updated addition to that one. I'm adding things I learned over the past 2 years since then. When I start an illustration, I like to think of it as a collection of decisions. Each step, the sketch, the lines, the colors, the shading, the background, involves asking, how do I want to portray this? Efficiency for me means I don't have to constantly figure out how to draw while I'm already in the middle of drawing. Instead, I can focus on what I'm drawing and how I want to portray it. 3 things really help with this. First, determining a setup. I decide in advance which brushes, tools, and layer structure I'll use. I actually keep a predefined Krita document with my favorite layer setup and copy that into each new file when it suits the illustration I want to draw. Brush-wise, I basically always use the same ones, which I'm blending in on screen here. From time to time, I'll experiment with other brushes for backgrounds and effects. For that, I can also use Clip Studio Paint, which I'll talk more about later. Second, determining a process. I follow roughly the same steps each time. That doesn't mean I can't experiment, but having a reliable structure makes it easier to stay focused. Point 3 would be using shortcuts. For me, this is very helpful. In Krita, I use keyboard shortcuts for various tools, such as the lasso or to transform things. I'll blend in the ones I most frequently use on screen here. Also, one thing that I really like about using Krita here is the tool pop-up palette. It allows me to switch between brushes, rotate the canvas, or even pick colors without having to manually move my hand around. It pops up wherever I'm on the drawing screen when I click a button on my pen. No matter what software you are using, after getting familiar with the program and figuring out how you would like to draw, I really recommend looking at the tools and features the program has to offer and how you can use this to your advantage. Next, let's go through each illustration step individually. Before even starting to draw, I gather references of characters, outfit pieces, mood, inspiration, and similar things on a mood board. For this, I use pure ref. I also use this board to keep track of and decide on variations I may make during the drawing process. Let's move on to this now. The sketch stage starts with figuring out the composition for me. Sometimes I already know what pose I want, sometimes I experiment by drawing quick variations. For example, when I worked on this illustration of Kanata from Paradox Live here, I knew I also wanted to draw Nayuta, his brother, in another illustration. Because of this, I wanted to see that both poses work nicely together. I first sketched one character sitting with their legs posed in different ways. I then used that to determine the second character's pose, so they would contrast each other nicely. I'll often test multiple leg or arm positions. I like to literally put versions side by side and ask myself which feels better, which makes the composition more interesting. To be able to answer these questions, you should have an idea for the intended mood of the piece, what it should convey to the viewer in mind. I knew I wanted this to be a stage setting, like the characters are performing. Due to this, a more dynamic angle and pose seemed nice to me. I also wanted the expressions to be happy, because Kanata enjoys singing. This brings me to the next aspect. Another thing I pay attention to here is face sketching. I have a kind of personal test question I keep coming back to throughout the process. Does the face look PFP worthy? By that I mean, is it a face that looks nice with an expression that feels alive? Also, PFP stands for Profile Picture, in case you didn't know what it means. What's important to me with the face is that the proportions can't be off. The jaw shape, the nose length, the eye size, all these little things matter, because when I look at art in general, the look of the face especially is what I tend to pay attention to. There are many pieces of art where the general look of the anatomy, the clothes, or the hair looks nice to me, but for the face it is rare for me to find one that really suits what I like 100%. Is this similar for you in some way? I would love to hear your thoughts. Overall, drawing is where fundamentals and preferences overlap. The fundamentals make the drawing look correct, but my preferences decide whether it feels right to me. When sketching clothes, I think in terms of texture and vibe. A white sweater will get fluffy, round strokes, while a leather jacket gets sharp, sleek strokes. I want the feeling of the outfit to already show in the sketch. Line art is slower and more decisive than sketching. I use longer strokes and pay more attention to pressure. Outer silhouette lines are usually thicker, while inner detail lines are thinner. I redraw a lot of my lines. I don't want them to look stiff. Using lighter pressure helps keep them flowy. I spend the most time on the face and hair. The lashes are often the thickest lines in my drawings. For hands, I pay attention to joints, usually 3 lines per finger for the upper and lower sides. When I draw close, I start with the silhouette, then add folds. Sometimes I leave small gaps in fold lines so they don't look too harsh. For accessories or symmetrical shapes, I'll even copy, paste, and transform parts if it makes sense. Most of the time I like giving different parts of the illustration a bit more 3D depth through line variation. Since most of my illustrations are fan art, I usually already have the base colors determined by the character design, but this doesn't mean I just copy them one to one. I often tint the colors slightly cooler or more purpley, or push them toward pastel tones. Adjusting saturation and contrast to suit my preferences also helps me make the artwork feel like my own. Sometimes I like to prepare a mini palette on the side of my canvas just to see how the colors look together before I fill them in. As you can see on my drawing setup, I have the color palette docker at the right lower corner of the screen here. I often use this to determine colors. The palette includes different colors I have used over time. This step is where everything comes alive. Most of the time, especially when it comes to more detailed illustrations like this one here, I block in the rough shading on one layer above all my colors. Like this, I'm able to quickly experiment with different lighting setups. Where do I want the light to come from? Do I also want to add some reflected light? What colors should the lighting and shadows have? These are some questions you can ask yourself at this stage. You can refer back to the initial idea and what mood you want to convey in the image, which I also mentioned in the sketch stage here. I also like to keep the blocking layers I decide I would go with, so I can apply them over the more regular shading I apply next. Often I like to separate the shading into these rough overall shading and lighting layers, and then the individual color group shadows. Let's talk about these next. In general, I go from bottom to top layer setup wise and add shadows and sometimes lights to each color here. For skin shading, I sometimes turn off the line art layer to check if the forms read well without lines. This helps me paint over issues like uneven asymmetry or awkward shadows. I layer shadows gradually, base shadow, then darker shadow, then lights, then reflected light, for example. For younger characters especially, adding blush on the cheeks or nose can also help to make them look more lively. For the eyes, I tend to reference the eye colors of the character I'm drawing. While the shading here can turn out a bit different for each illustration, I like to generally add some shadows at the top and light at the bottom, with 1 or 2 colorful overlays as well. For hair, I shade with zigzaggy or painterly strokes, keeping the spherical shape of the head in mind. Ends of hair strands often get darker. Highlights are placed mostly around the forehead. I also like to add hue variation, sometimes cooler tones in the shadows, warmer tones in the lights. Since hair is more translucent, adding a lot of reflected light and shininess can help to separate it from the other parts in your drawing, which can in turn help to draw attention to the character's head. Shading clothes is all about material. Smooth fabric gets soft gradients, leather gets sharper edges, white cloth gets big round shadows. Gold or metal gets both shadows and lights to look shiny. In some illustrations, I will also apply a saturated border around shadow areas, especially for the skin. This kind of subsurface scattering effect can help to make the illustration look more lively and realistic. However, I also like to keep in mind that the shading doesn't have to look realistic here. Adding some fun neon colors or saturated borders that may not make that much sense can work in your favor. It can make the illustration more unique and appealing. I don't always draw a background, but when I do, I try to keep it simple so it doesn't steal the focus from the character. One helpful trick is to balance lightness and darkness. If a character has a dark outfit, I'll often use a lighter background so they stand out, and vice versa. Backgrounds don't always need to be detailed. Even a hint of shapes, some color gradients, or small props can go a long way. Most of the time I'll even incorporate textures and assets, for example from the Clip Studio asset library here. I tend to blur out some of the elements, and the assets are especially helpful for finalizing the illustration by adding effects as well. Some final effects that I can make use of would include blur textures, for example grain or watercolor ones, and small particles. Before moving on to the final stage, I also color my lines here. I have developed a workflow for this using copies of my color layer and clipping them over my line art. I explained this in more detail in my previous drawing process video, so if it interests you, you can check it out after this one. One thing to note here would be that I make use of layer modes for the line art here usually. We haven't talked about layer modes in this video yet, so here's a quick rundown on how I use layer modes for the different drawing stages. I only use other layer modes than the normal one for the shading, background and final adjustments. In some cases, when I experiment with colors, I can also use them for the filling in colors stage. For shading, I most commonly use multiply for shadows and screen or overlay for lights. For the background and effects, such as textures, the overlay layer mode as well as the burn one tends to be useful. Sometimes I'll also experiment with modes such as hue, HSV, color or luminosity. It's similar with the final adjustment stage, where I can also add some filter masks. These can include a hue, saturation, brightness filter, curves or levels. Speaking of which, let's move on to the last stage, the fixing and adjustments stage next. This is one of my favorite stages because it's where the illustration gets polished. For this, I tend to export the illustration once, and usually a few days to weeks after this, I look at the illustration and note down things I want to change. I make a critique of what I see. I find it good to have a bit of time from exporting the image and critiquing it, so my eyes get a fresh view of what I'm seeing. When critiquing, I also tend to mirror the image. After I have my notes written down, I can then start to fix what I wrote down. Most of the time, I point out things that look off here, such as the eye symmetry or the anatomy. Here are a few more techniques I like to use while critiquing and then also fixing the artwork. Mirror the canvas. Flipping helps reveal mistakes. Zoom out to check overall composition. Make a black and white version to check values and contrast. Toggle visibility of variations to compare different versions side by side. Keep copies of earlier stages so I can go back if needed. In Krita specifically, I use the recorder feature here. Krita creates a folder where all the frames which can later be used for exporting a time-lapse are saved. I can go through all the frames in this folder and pick out ones I would like to use. Then I can drag them onto my reference window. This is how I can easily have work in progress images. It's also good for reviewing my process later. When fixing, I use lasso, liquify and transform tools a lot. This is why I often merge layers at this point. Adjusting on 100 plus separate layers would take forever. Like this, the illustration is done. Let's talk about art fails, because I think it's just as valuable to share mistakes as it is to share successes. Successes can inspire and motivate you, and you can learn from mistakes. One fail for me is spending a really long time on drawing a detail, only to realize it's completely covered in the final illustration. This can happen with anything that gets hidden. It's not wasted practice, but it is a good reminder. Look at the pose and outfit design before you dive too deep. Ask yourself, is this detail even going to be visible? Figuring out the general body and pose, making sure anatomy works underneath all the clothes and hair is important. But adding too many details early on can take away from the time you have for adding the actual details that are going to be visible in the final illustration later on. Another fail, getting too attached to one version of a pose or face when there might be a better variation. That's why I like making multiple versions side by side. It forces me to compare and choose. And one more, ignoring perspective in clothing folds. If folds don't follow the perspective of the body or flow of the pose, they can look off. When it comes to fixing art, another fail I've had to deal with and am still falling into sometimes is being obsessive. With this I mean that you try to change something over and over even though nothing seems to work out. I realize that in these situations focusing on another part of the illustration or doing something else entirely can be a much more effective use of your time. When coming back to that part after some time, I then tend to have a much more clear vision on what I would like to change. In other cases, watching a tutorial or searching for references on what I'm struggling with has helped as well. So if you ever fall into this loop of fixing one thing over and over, try to realize this, be aware of your process and how much time you spend on what. Like this, you can recognize moments like these and avoid them, and use your time in a more mindful way. After some fails, I'll go over some Krita specific tips and tools I find useful. Since I've been using the program for years, I've discovered these to be really helpful. Some of these tips can also be translated into other programs. First, the pop-up palette. It allows quick color and brush switching. Next would be using predefined layer structures. It saves setup time. Then we have the recorder feature. It's useful for drawing frames and the time-lapse. Finally, the grow selection option. It helps when filling in flat colors with the wand tool, so there are no gaps where the line art is. Using these tools, among many others, has made my drawing process much more efficient and enjoyable over time. And that's it for my drawing process, from sketch to finished piece, plus mistakes to avoid and some Krita tips along the way. Now I want to hear from you. Which part of your own drawing process do you enjoy most? Which part of your own drawing process do you find most difficult? And which illustration I showed today do you like most? I look forward to hearing your thoughts and discovering new processes and tools for drawing over time. Maybe you would also like to share some of your favorite tips and advice when it comes to improving at art in the comments, so we can all learn from each other. If you want to see more, check out my older video where I explained my illustration process. It goes deeper into certain steps like shading and background lighting, so it's a nice companion to this one. On my Patreon, you can find full screen recorded process videos, time lapses, and full resolution images of my art. Prints and stickers of some of my illustrations are also available if you would like to support me. My dream is to one day be a full-time artist, working on my own projects and helping other people through this, bringing light into their life. That's why any support means a lot. I hope this video gave you some helpful advice and maybe even some motivation for your next drawing. Thank you for watching. Have a nice day. Bye.